Hello, welcome to my second vlog. This is Susie Marsh, LCSW, that's Licensed Clinical Social Worker, coming to you from Melbourne, Florida. And I would like to talk about the codependency issues a little bit more in depth with you today. And we'll talk a little bit also about recovery and hope for recovery. So let's go back to the first step in the 12-step programs and why, as a therapist, I find this very important. The first year that I was clean and sober in a 12-step program, I was so lucky to have that experience before I ever became a therapist, because they teach you in those programs how to really look at yourself, how to look at your own behavior, how to stop blaming other people. You know, as an addict, we love to blame other people, the family especially, for why we used and how we keep using and how it's their fault. And self-pity and many other symptoms that continue the addictive behavior. But the first step breaks through, number one, the denial, the excuses, the projections, all of the defenses that we use to not face reality and to not face the emotions that happen when you start to break an addiction. Breaking addiction is like losing a lover. It's like losing a lover who turned bad on you, but you give up this addiction the same way that you give up a lover that's gone bad. There's a book written by Joseph Cruz, MD, about this love addiction, this love style with our addictions. So as an addict, I had to come to terms with, I really did not believe that anything was wrong with me. And I remember on my not only that, I was an atheist, of course. How could you live the way I lived, shooting dope a couple of times, living with a rock and roll band that was, at one time, a couple of us were shooting dope. Anyway, we got kind of sick. So how can you be a Christian or a Catholic that I was raised and do the kind of things that I was doing? Just some depravity and some sick things. So I was, of course, an atheist. At my very first 12-step meeting, that a friend of mine who was with me at a restaurant the day that I got fired, he said to me, "Why don't you go with me to this meeting?" I said, "What meeting?" He said, "It's where people who don't want to use drugs anymore go." And I said, "Oh, that's cool. Okay, I'll try that." So the next day, he took me to this 12-step meeting for people who want to get off drugs. And I didn't really think I had a drug problem. As a matter of fact, at age 24, I was sure I didn't have a drug problem and I wasn't really an addict. But I wanted to fit in, so I said I was an addict. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. At the end of that meeting, this woman came up to me and hugged me and said she was happy to be my sponsor. And I didn't know what that was, but I said, okay, always trying to please everyone and be loved. And I said, okay. And she said, "So tonight, I would like you to pray to your higher power." And I said, "Well, you can stop right there. I don't pray because I'm an atheist." And she said, "That's fine. I would like you to pray to your higher power and say, 'Higher power, I don't believe that you exist. But if you do, would you let me know?'" And I said, "Well, that's really cool. That's a great idea. I think I'll do that." Little did I know, I was so broken at that point that I wouldn't do anything. In my mind, I was not broken and I wasn't an addict and things weren't that bad. When I looked back on it by working more of the 12 steps and then in therapy, it was really obvious that I had gotten very sick and could not see it at all. The denial was like scales in front of my eyes, and the 12-step program and therapy were the cure for those scales and for allowing a higher power into my life. That night, I was on my knees like she told me to do. I was doing exactly what she said, and I said, "Higher power, I don't believe that you exist." At that moment, my cat, she was a kitten at that time, jumped into my lap. And I said to myself, unconditional love, that's my higher power. That's a higher power. And the kitten began to be named Desiree as a desire to stop using drugs. So I wanted her to reflect that spiritual experience that she brought to me that night, that I came to believe that there was a higher power. and that higher power was unconditional love that I could see in animals and that I could express in animals, even though I couldn't express it in my family, didn't see it in other people, except a few friends. And Desiree began to be a reminder every time I said her name and every time I saw her. She was unconditionally loving. So the desire to stop using was the first experience I had. Now I could not come to terms with that word addict. So I continued to say the prayer that she told me to say, along with, I don't believe you exist. If you do, let me know. I continued to say that. And I began to say, I don't believe that I'm an addict. I really don't. If I do, let me know. And I didn't think of it. I just kept saying that prayer and I didn't think of it again. I had an experience that I'll tell you about later when we talk about spirituality that was a very transformative, supernatural experience that happened to me that allowed me to believe on a much deeper level that I was an addict and that there was a higher power in my life. But the first step had to take hold inside of me. I had to stop using. That night, I did not use again. I didn't use again, and I haven't used for 37 years. But that night, I started saying those prayers, which was every morning, please keep me clean, meaning free from drugs. And at night, thank you for keeping me clean. Now, I said that even though I didn't believe that I was an addict. And to me, nowadays, I believe that's one of the reasons I didn't use drugs during the time of denial. Well, the first step, praying about that first step and helping me to see how I was an addict, does help remove denial. But a really good written first step, grueling as the first one is an eye-opener. The desire to use drugs and alcohol or to gamble, to be addicted to another person, to be addicted to an alcoholic or an addict, those desires and addictive behaviors come from the subconscious brain. I'm sure there's some that comes from the unconscious brain also. I'm sure of that as an addict. But the subconscious brain is not conscious. So it's very difficult to do this by yourself. When you go to 12-step meetings, and of course I believe in therapy, you are reminded constantly of this disease. You must get a hold on the disease before you move forward spiritually. And you must move forward spiritually if you're going to heal the brain in those areas that have been damaged. In late stage addiction, there is permanent brain damage. In mid stage and early stage addiction, it's not permanent. The brain changes, but it will go back to normal. It takes a long time, couple of years, but every time you exercise these areas of the brain that psychotherapy and the 12 steps teach you to use, the written tools, the prayer and meditation tools, all of those are healing the brain, sharing in a meeting in front of people, getting support, getting love and hugs. All of those things seek to heal the brain. So as you do what you're told to do in a recovery program and keep an open mind, many of those behaviors are healing the damage that the drugs have done. Daniel Amen, MD, his first book was wonderful. He showed teenagers who'd been using drugs or alcohol for, let's say, marijuana for 3 years at a time. He would show you the picture of a normal brain. I have it in the back. I'll bring it out to you next time. He shows you the picture of a normal brain. And then he shows you Jamie at age 20 after 3 years of marijuana use. Janet, her brain, or a normal brain, not using drugs or alcohol at age 23, and Janet at age 23 after 2 years of crystal meth. There's holes in the brain where there shouldn't be holes. There's gaps around the brain from the skull where there shouldn't be gaps. Again, depending on when you stop using, this addiction in the brain can be cleared out and the brain can go back to full of water, which nourishes the blood supply and lets the blood flow to those areas of the brain that have been deprived. and allow the brain to heal. It takes time, and it takes working a program of, to me, therapy and the 12 steps. I know there's a lot of people that don't believe in the 12 steps and therapy only. My personal journey went to both. I was lucky. I believe I was lucky to have had that experience and to have been involved in recovery starting at age 24, a very young age, to get in recovery. Alcoholics used to have to wait till they hit bottom at age 50 or 60, sometimes closer to 65, and not seek help. We didn't have 12-step programs until the 50s, or maybe, I'm sorry, it was the 40s. So we didn't have 12-step programs then. People didn't have a place to go, and they were thrown into institutions, whether that was jail or psychiatric institutions, where people didn't really understand addiction and couldn't understand why addicts and alcoholics couldn't just stop. The DARE program, Just Stop, these things don't work in an unconscious or subconscious behavior. Subconscious behaviors need a program that regularly reminds us of why we're here and what happened to us. The first step is a written history of the drug addiction and the behaviors that resulted. It's hard to remember what we were like without using drugs, or a family member without having a family member who became mentally ill or drug addicted or alcoholic. It's hard to remember what it was like back then. But when you do a written first step in the way that the 12-step programs teaches us, it gives you this slow progression, and you see how your behavior changed. You see how you could become so sick. You see how the addict or alcoholic or mentally ill person many times directed your behavior in such a way that you became sick, and sicker than sometimes they became. So I believe in both the 12 steps and psychotherapy. Psychotherapy really allows you to address the emotional aspect of the brain recovery in a different way than the 12 steps do, and in my opinion, in a deeper way, or it certainly did for me, and it certainly was my experience as a therapist working with 12-step people and non-12-step people. The psychological clearing up of the brain, I believe, happens on a deeper level in psychotherapy. Now, you may not ever go to psychotherapy, or you may not ever go to 12-step programs, and you can do it your own way. This is just what worked for me and what works for the clients that I work with. The first step is a chronological history of the slide from normal alcohol and drug use, which for most of us, that very first experience is different than it is for people that don't have an addiction. Most of us remember that first taste, that first high, like no other. I don't remember my first taste of beer because we lived in Germany and I had it at about age 2 when I would take sips of beer from my dad's beer. I vaguely remember really loving the bubbles and loving this dark sort of taste without any sweetness. I remember liking that bitter, dark taste. Or maybe that's something I've told myself. But I do remember some of the early times in smoking marijuana and drinking as a teenager, and what that was like, and how very quickly partying became part of my lifestyle, and everyone's lifestyle that I used with as a teenager. At that time, in the early and mid 70s, the popular group where I grew up in Athens, Georgia, during my teen years, was using drugs. And I was a part of that group, and a part of partying and early exposure to sex and sexuality, early exposure to alcohol and drugs, and in some cases, harder drugs. Now, my opinion is that marijuana is a hard drug because it's such a hallucinogenic drug, and it's not classified in any of the other drugs. It's very different. Thank God I never did the marijuana that they do nowadays, because it's so much stronger. Marijuana made me paranoid, like a lot of people with bipolar. It seems to have a bad effect early on, and we stop using it. I'm grateful for that, because marijuana, I just didn't enjoy it. Mind you, if there was nothing else, I would certainly smoke marijuana if I couldn't get anything else, because I was an addict. But marijuana is a gateway drug. Many people will use marijuana before, like me, before I used IV drugs or crystal meth or ecstasy or more dangerous drugs. So sometimes marijuana can be the first drug that a teenager will use because it's easier to get than alcohol. So it's important to know that. I know that my parents let us drink at home as teenagers because they thought that was a safer way for us to learn to drink. Turns out that research has proven that that is absolutely wrong. It is a way that teaches leniency and a lack of boundaries, and increases the ability to use more chemicals, increases the ability to have less personal boundaries around your own alcohol and drug use when there's leniency in the home. So hopefully you have heard of that and you're not allowing that to happen with your kids. We didn't know that back then. So hopefully you have better boundaries. Of course, my mother was the child of an alcoholic. My father came from a family with lots of depression. So into the family, they brought their own codependencies and their own lack of knowledge. You have to think of it. In the 40s, people didn't go to therapy. Nowadays, if you go to therapy, it's not thought of as something bad. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it still wasn't less stigmatized like it is nowadays. In some big cities, everyone has a therapist. Every person with a lot of money seems to have a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst, and it's just part of the culture. Well, that didn't happen back then. It certainly didn't happen when I was being raised. You were looked upon if you went to a therapist or a psychiatrist, and we certainly didn't have the kind of medications they really were sedating and not comfortable to be on or to take at that time. So a lot of them just didn't help and people didn't take them. So my family was an example of a dysfunctional family by no fault of their own. Who chooses that to happen? I'm sure my father didn't choose to have depression or come from a family that was very depressed. He came from Marshville, North Carolina, and I thought this was apropos when I learned that in Marshville, named after a great relative of mine, in Marshville, they used to say, "quiet as a marsh," because the Marsh brothers didn't talk much. Maybe they were all depressed. I know my dad didn't talk much at all until his later years, and when he sought help for himself and became my best friend and began to talk and share a lot of non-personal stuff, but share a lot with me, and really encouraged me to open up to him. And that was a wonderful end of his life experience for me to have a good friend. And that came about as a result of my recovery, which allowed me to confront both of my parents on behaviors that were really detrimental to my growth, which they, luckily for me, were very open-minded to, having had their own experience in therapy by that time. Were very open to. We all cried together and loved each other and hugged and kissed, and it was probably one of the most important days in my own recovery. It was so long ago now, it was over 30 years ago, but it still was an important marker in my recovery of letting go of a lot of old family baggage when my parents were able to hear and probably ignore some things that weren't true at all, but just allow me to say them and lay blame. Well, that was the best I could do at that time. Lay a lot of blame and just have a lot of empathy for me and let me let go of a lot of that dysfunctional behavior and a lot of blaming and a lot of picking fights and being negative. So that was an opportunity that was given to me through the 12 steps. And of course, psychotherapy then helped me prepare for it, and an opportunity rose up serendipitously, and I took it, and my parents and I did a lot of healing. We're coming to just about the end of this section. I want for you to know that there is hope in recovery. The first step breaks through the denial, the excuse making, the projecting, the inability to face reality, the lies that we tell ourselves, the way we lie to ourselves. All of us do that if we have a compulsive behavior, again, whether that's relationship addiction, eating disorders, anorexia, gambling, nicotine, alcohol, drugs, or family members of an addict, codependency. So all of us have that addictive, compulsive behavior early on, and that has to be addressed. It's like it clears the mind out of the cobwebs so that the next phase of recovery, having hope, and opening up to a higher power. Many times a 12-step program or a therapy group can be like a higher power, because 10 opinions and 10 ears listening to the decisions you're about to make can really help you prevent a disastrous decision. And that's what we get a lot of out of early recovery, is being willing to open up about where we are and get other people's opinion and advice instead of thinking I know everything, which I certainly thought of probably for about 15 to 20 years of my recovery. So it allows us to be open-minded and to take others' opinion with a grain of salt and really listen to ourselves. So I love that about recovery, and I still love that about learning about my own internal narcissism and how I can think that I know it all and know what's best, when many times other people's opinions, like my husband's, are actually much more grounded in reality than mine can be. And learning that early on how to take that feedback and how to be willing to hear other people's opinions, as hard as it was in the beginning, as much as it offended my ego in the beginning, it became a wonderful way of life. Not to say that I don't still cry or get upset if I have to hear negative feedback. It might only last a few minutes instead of days or weeks. But that is a gift that recovery gives us, having an open mind. Having an open mind to a higher power allows us to open up areas of our brain that are stifled by compulsive behavior. That's partly in the neocortex, the part of the brain that uses problem solving, experiences a higher power, experiences empathy, experiences the ability to give empathy. Again, problem solving, higher level complex problems, higher theories like spirituality and family values and complexity of family systems and family relationships, and some of the higher complex systems in 12-step recovery that comes from studying the program or studying a religion and what your religion is teaching you. So we'll talk a little bit more about the second and third step and how that correlates to therapy on our third video log. Thanks so much for tuning in to Susie Meffin, LCSW. See you next week. Thanks. Bye.